What champ is balanced from the lowest win rate? Currently, it's K'Sante. K'Sante is the lowest win rate champ in the game who is probably still viable. And it's because he is really strong in pro play and has a lot of agency, meaning and a lot of skill expression, meaning that even if his win rate's really low, he still is can win games if you are good enough at him and play him well enough and adapt to the situations well enough. Can you make it so picking a source of AP doesn't feel bad? I mean, what do you mean by that? Do you mean picking one AP is weak and you need to pick more? Or do you mean that picking AP is kind of just bad in general and you shouldn't pick any? More than one? I'm surprised to hear that because typically you do not need more than one AP source to be strong. It's typically the case that having multiple sources of AP damage is dangerous for your team because a tank can then just build defense and counter you. So the hard part about making double AP viable is actually the nature of AP. Doesn't mean we couldn't do it, but here's the thing. The average AP champion in League of Legends is a burst character. That doesn't mean they're all burst characters, you know, like Kayle or Gwen or sustained damage, but the average AP champion in League of Legends is a burst character. Therefore, the average magic resist item has to be tuned around countering a burst character, which means that if a tank gets a lot of magic resist, it can be really good because you're countering a burst character. There's not a lot of AP characters that provide sustained damage. One of the reasons multiple sources of physical damage are strong is because they all do sustained damage. So even if you buy defense against them, they'll eventually be able to break through it. Whereas the average AP character is a burst character. And so by getting multiple AP characters, you're all competing against characters who are countering burst. And you're like, okay, well, then why don't you just make, why don't we make, say, magic resist weaker then? The hard part there is that magic resist being weaker then means that well, okay, what happens if there's only one AP character and you need to buy some magic resist? Is it actually effective against that one guy who's trying to burst you? And so mainly, the general observation is it's the tuning. One of the challenges is the tuning of burst versus sustained damage. And generally, there's more physical damage in the game, considering that physical damage is sustained. Man, I feel like I said a bunch of things that don't make any sense now that I'm reviewing what I just talked about. Okay, how to better talk about this? What is a better way to describe this that is actually understandable? Say you're Lux. You burst people, right? If a tank builds defense against you, they're going to counter you. Hooray! The amount of defense that tank needs to get to counter you is there to account for the fact that you're a burst character. If you take two burst characters and you put them together, they're still burst, basically. And so a tank countering one burst character tends to also be fairly decent at countering two burst characters. Whereas a tank that is building to counter one DPS character is not necessarily as good at countering two DPS characters because they combine their DPS together to DPS down the tank. Does that make sense? Is that more sensible what I'm saying? It's kind of the idea that against the front line at the very least, stacking burst is not necessarily on average going to be as effective as stacking sustained damage, and the average magic resist item has to be tuned around allowing a tank to avoid being bursted by an AP character because the average AP damage in the game is burst instead of sustained. Tenacity screws AP champs more than armor does to AD champs. Well, one thing AD champs have is they always have their basic attack, right? Even a character like Talon or Kha'Zix at the very least can basic attack you if they fail to burst you. Now, their basic attacks aren't going to be amazing, but they always have that, right? And that's a big deal. Whereas for an AP champion, if you fail to burst someone, that's it. You lose. You didn't burst them. You're out of steam. So that might be something going on. But yeah, overall, it's just the game tends to make the most sense when it's balanced around singular AP threats as opposed to double. That said, that's not necessarily perfect. Maybe we are supposed to do some changes that make it so multiple AP threats make more sense. An example of this would be something like Old Will of the Ancients. That's one way you could do it. That probably isn't the optimal way to do it, but Old Will of the Ancients was an item AP champions could buy that gave an aura that gave other AP champions on their team AP and spell vamp. So it's you'd get Wodas, and then you'd be now we're really strong because we're both buffing each other with our main stat. What do you say about Lux ulting every 15 seconds with 2 CDR items? Seems fine to me. No joke. Let's see how to talk about that. Some spells have enough context to them that cooldown doesn't matter nearly as much. Two examples of this are Lux Ult and Jinx Ult. So Lux Ult and Jinx Ult are spells that are highly conditional as to when you can actually get value out of them. Typically, with Lux as an example, the determination of whether Lux can ult you and get effect out of Lux's ult has nothing to do with her casting her ult or her ult cooldown, and a lot more to do with did she CC you? And were you low enough that after she CC'd you, she could ult you and cause you to die, right? She also has her passive, and the ult detonates the passive, and so a good portion of the damage on the ult is then, in the passive. And so Jinx Ult is another example, and one of the reasons Jinx Ult gets to such a low cooldown is because it's like, well, yeah, it's a powerful spell, but they have to be low, they have to not be next to you, and that has to hit them. All of which things aren't, like, conditional. So yeah, basically it's like, most ultimates should, and it is good, and they should be gated by cooldown. Like, it's better that way. But in regards to something like Lux Ult, it is already gated by how the context around when you can actually effectively cast it. Why are some characters only balanced for the 0.01% over the 99%? Like, if I find a pro character, why can't I enjoy them because of pro? Because we'll start out with, there's 160 champions in League of Legends, so not every champion needs to be for you. And I know that's rough, because sometimes a champion that you want to be for you isn't, and like, that sucks. I'm not saying that doesn't suck, it definitely sucks. That could be really sad. That said, though, League of Legends Pro Play, I think it's a little incorrect to say balanced for the 0.1%. Because you have to understand that just because only 0.1% of players play in Pro, it doesn't mean that, A, they don't deserve to enjoy the game. That's important. But then also, they do deserve to enjoy the game, is what I mean, to make sure that that's clear, right? They deserve to enjoy the game. But also, the vast majority of League of Legends players watch Pro and care about Pro. And so even though not every League of Legends player plays Pro, Pro is popular enough with players in general in terms of being a watched thing, that it's still incredibly important that it's well-balanced and fun. Like, that's something that has to be true, even if not everybody's playing it. Will League ever have truly large changes, like changing how many players go to individual lanes, or maybe just changing which lanes are best for certain classes? We've done that. The risk of that is that players often heavily dislike them. It doesn't mean they're guaranteed to be disliked, but as an example, again, it's been 6 years at this point, I feel old. 6 years ago, we tried to make it so you could play something other than AD carries in bot lane. And that was received very poorly by AD carry players. There was even some pro players who basically essentially went on strike saying, I am not going to play this role until AD carries are back, right? And so there's always risk with really large changes that, like, especially when the game is old as League, it's just people are used to playing a certain way. People are used to playing the game a certain way, and so changing how they play the game, it's not something that's like, I'm not saying you should never do it, but it's something you should, like, you really want to be, like, very cognizant of that it's risky. Smooth AKALI, ever since the QE mechanic was removed, she feels clunky and bugged. I am not convinced that is true. A lot of times when we remove mechanics like that, it's because, contrary to them being anti-clunk, they're more like, this makes this character, like, have no cast times in very important situations where they should. Doesn't mean there couldn't be work we could do on her to make her feel smoother, but, like, those kind of things probably shouldn't get to feel like butter, because they probably, like, greatly reduce the character's ability to be played against. It's really important in League of Legends that characters, like, can't always just, like, roll past their cast times. But that said, I'm not an AKALI expert, so maybe there are some things that she does that could be improved on.